Welcome to this webinar, which is about company funding in the context of the current COVID crisis. This, of course, is for the OBN Bio Trinity 2020. My name is Mike Sheeran. I'm a Senior Tax Manager at James Cooper Creston. So this is just the agenda of the things we're going to be talking about today. The first is the current status of equity funding tax reliefs in tech companies in particular. The second one is relatively hot off the press now, not so hot as it was, and that's the thing called the Future Fund, which is something that fundraising tech companies may well be interested in from the government. And the third one is very briefly on some share and share option issues currently. So moving on to company funding, and just initially I'm going to say some probably fairly obvious things really, but as with many tech companies, of course, financing of biotech companies, especially looking at early stage ones, will often be governed by a cycle of funding, a sort of almost a predictable cycle of funding. And so companies like that, they'll have long-term and fairly predictable R&D and other investment requirements. And those will be met by a reasonably pre-planned, as I say, reasonably predictable series of funding rounds, right from the start of fairly small founder and angel funding through to the heavier lifting of Series A and B and further rounds like that, whatever you call those larger rounds. And so each round, right from the start, is designed to provide normally fairly substantial funding that's required to just pass the next milestones. And so you're looking through to the next step with that next round as earmarked after a reasonably predictable time period. And in many cases, of course, there won't actually be income from sales or licensing from your product in the early stages. So that external funding is really earmarked to cover just about all your predicted costs. And because of that, it may not feel like this, of course, to many companies, but many companies will have that sort of pot of money that they've raised from just that initial or previous round of funding. And as I say, it may well not feel like this, but as opposed to some non-tech companies, you've got a sort of pot of money that should take you through to the next phase. Of course, there will now be all sorts of other risks and challenges that have come through from the current situation. Before I talk about the equity funding, of course, there will be a range of non-sales type funding for these sort of companies. As I say, we'll look at equity funding in a bit. There will be bank lending there will be grants, there'll be R&D tax credits, which is another big subject, and all sorts of other non-dilutive funding, i.e. funding that doesn't dilute your equity. And just for some more detailed discussion on this, you might want to look at the excellent publication which is called From Seed to Unicorn, which you'll find fairly easily on the OBN website. Just another reference there to R&D tax credits, which of course many tech companies and biotech companies will find quite a useful source of cash flow income. This talk won't deal with those, but I would refer you to an excellent separate webinar which is very much on the live issues about R&D tax credits, which is being given by my colleague Margaret Savory. So you should also find that on the list of webinars. Moving to equity funding in particular, even here there's quite a variety, of course, of types of funding which is given tax relief. Perhaps some will be even more familiar to you than others. There's SEIS for the very early stage companies and EIS for the slightly older and larger companies, and VCTs, of course, and finally enterprise capital funds, which many of you will use, and probably is on balance is the less well known sort of this tax relieved funding. And you may well have raised these in the past, or even be in the course of raising funds under them, or of course proposed for the future. As I say, once your current milestones and your current funding starts to fade out. So looking a bit more at the tax relief side of equity funding and splitting it into funding you've raised in the past, where you are now and in the future. But past EIS funding raises, that is reasonably safe, I think it's fair to say, or should we say no more insecure than it would have been other than under COVID. There's a fairly well-known period of 3 years past each actual fundraising from where you've issued EIS funds, where you need to be keeping some of the conditions, and it's quite important to keep an eye on those. In particular, you need to have some care during those 3 years on the effects of further transactions, and that's because in that 3 years, one of the number of things that you need to look out for is that you don't come under any corporate control, you don't become a subsidiary of any other company. So clearly, in any of the transactions you may be looking for now as part of the current brought on by the current situation, and you may take in some further funding, you need to be careful that as part of that you don't come under the control of any other company, for instance some other company you bring in as an investor. In terms of current EIS funding, you may be really just now looking at completing some funding or moving fairly imminently to some further funding. I just say to be aware of any lobbying for changes to the EIS rules around the so-called future fund, etc. And I'll talk a bit about that further on. You may well be looking for advance assurance. In fact, of course, that's really much to be recommended. And one particular thing you may need to take care on is the condition about financial health for SEIS or SEIS company, because that has always been a condition there that's possibly not been looked at too much, but of course in the current situation the whole question of financial health may be even more to the fore, so that's one worth possibly covering in some detail in your advance assurance. And then finally, looking slightly more remotely to any future funding that you may be looking for, there's no current sign of ending the EIS or VCT regimes or even changing them in any great measure, but you may well need to plan early if your funding needs accelerate again in the current situation. Just a brief mention here on the interaction with other so-called state aids. Of course, the whole state aid regime is essentially one under EU legislation that's governed the UK as long as we've been part of the EU. Some of the existing non-equity funding that companies can get, so that's in particular R&D tax credits and grant funding, do involve some interactions between the various state aid categories. And in particular, things that you may need to look out for is that SEIS is called what's called a de minimis aid, so it's sort of allowed for under EU rules, but it's part of a particular cap of €200,000 in any 3-year period that a company can receive this sort of funding. And that's especially relevant around grants, because some of the grants, say from Innovate UK, are again called de minimis aid, and any company needs to keep a running total of all that sort of aid it's received up to that €200,000 cap in any 3-year period. And that's one particular one to watch out for, is if you're claiming SEIS, if you're issuing funds on which SEIS will be claimed, then that needs to be borne in mind if you've previously had grants as to whether you're about to breach that €200,000 cap. R&D repayable tax credits don't actually impact SEIS or EIS in this way, and vice versa. So there's no sort of interaction there. The new so-called CBILS loan funding, which is the Business Interruption Loan Scheme, is actually state aid, but it isn't de minimis. So again, these are just sort of various interactions you need to keep in mind between the various sort of funding types that we have. A bit about where we are on some lobbying around SEIS and EIS rules. Until recently, some companies who are about to raise SEIS and EIS funds were waiting to see if the various tax rates might be extended or if the rules might be relaxed just purely because of the current situation. That's okay if you can afford to wait, and we have seen some companies doing that. But the answer to this lobbying that's been going out to the government may have been already given now as of the 20th of April, and I'll talk a bit about that further. So as we speak currently, on the 27th of April, there's no sign that the government is about to relax or extend the SEIS or EIS rules. Some other timing issues. It may actually be in your investors' interests to do some SEIS or EIS investments around now or going forward, so that they then can claim income tax relief and their own personal tax refunds on those investments. They can do that actually in the current tax year via the pay-as-you-earn system if they pay tax under pay-as-you-earn, or they could relate an investment that's happening this year back to last tax year. So that may be a way your investors may actually be wanting to accelerate potentially some SEIS or EIS investments to get their own tax relief back. So I mentioned a couple of times this thing called the Future Fund, which is one of many of this raft of announcements the government has given about helping out businesses of different sorts. As I say, the SEIS and EIS advisory bodies had been lobbying the government for various relaxations or improvements in the current environment. In particular, the body called the EIS Association had been lobbying for an increase in personal tax reliefs on it for investors up to 60%. Again, they would see that as a way of encouraging investors to put money into growing companies so that those investors could get their own personal tax reliefs back. The government haven't responded right directly to that lobbying as such, but what they did announce back on the 20th of April were a couple of measures, including a thing called a Future Fund, which is aimed very much in the equity investment context. And that's alongside, as I say, other various steps they've announced, such as the business interruption loan scheme, and of course furloughing, which is a bit more well known. So the Future Fund initiatives, which by the way seem to be ready to be launched next month in May 2020, would be about loans from the government between 125,000 and 250,000. And by the way, these appear to be direct loans from the government and not this sort of guarantee type arrangement for the CBILS arrangement, where banks are being encouraged to make those loans. These would be direct government loans of those amounts. And this will only be available if the company is at the same time raising the same amount from investors. Not quite clear at the moment whether that is only talking about equity investment for investors or loans as well. But also these are only available if the company itself has previously raised more than £250,000 from investors in the last 5 years. So I suppose this is aimed at companies which are certainly not immediate fresh start companies. They've obviously been through fairly chunky fundraising already, at least to that 250,000 mark. So it is a loan, it's unsecured, it's basically on a 36-month term with what might appear to be quite a high interest rate of at least 8% per annum. But what can happen to these loans is that they can actually be convertible into shares, either at the next funding round or in the case of a sale or an IPO of that company, or on this maturity, which could be the 36-month term. So this moves to the quite interesting situation where the government may have lent these amounts to you as a company, but could convert those into shares and actually become a shareholder in your company. And you may say that we could leave it to you as to whether you would like the concept of the government being a shareholder. But that's not a given. That's only would happen in those certain circumstances. It may well be, of course, that you would be able to repay the loan on the terms given. So on this Future Fund arrangement, you may well be regarded as a top-up to some of your other current or proposed further funding, you may regard it, I just mentioned there the concept of the government actually becoming a shareholder in you. I mean, if you did that, in a sense, it could well be regarded as a lower cost to the company if it is converted to equity, as opposed to having to pay that loan back. For instance, if you were a company that was lucky enough to be working towards quite a valuable exit, then the government would sort of reap its reward from that as a shareholder along with the other shareholders. But depending on the percentage amount the government took in this way, it may be something you would actually regard as a fairly non-expensive form of funding along the way. On that same day, 20th of April 2020, the government announced a couple of other fundings proposals. One which is via Innovate UK for some further grant funding that's available for existing customers of Innovate and new applicants. So whether or not you have been a customer of Innovate UK in the past for grant funding, you may want to look to see what's available going forward. And separately from that, the government department, SEIS, had announced that it's operating and offering up to £50,000 of grants per company for a variety of COVID-related innovation projects. So if you're a company that you at all think you are getting involved in any of these projects that will benefit the fight against COVID in various ways, then it may be worth looking at one or other of those grants. And finally, in this webinar, I just wanted to cover a separate area really, which is around the whole area of employment-related shares and share options. This may well not be your first priority at the moment, but of course, share and share option awards to your key staff have always had their place as what I'd call potentially cash-free incentive or payment or future reward for those staff. I say in the sense that, of course, it's not involving cash salary, but it's an offer for future share participation in the company. There's one little question which currently is exercising advisors a bit, which is under the EMI share options, which of course is the most tax advantage and flexible sort of share options. And one requirement for being involved in EMI share options is that the employee must work more than 25 hours working time with any particular company, or if they work less than that, they've got to work at least 75% of their overall working time with you. And of course, in the concept of furloughing them, the whole idea is that they are really going into sort of deep freeze working for you. And so there is this risk that you are ceasing to meet that working time requirement, at which point their share options might lose the various valuable tax advantages. Clearly that's not ideal, and at the current date, HMRC have been asked about giving some sort of relaxation of that, but I'm not aware as of the date that we speak that they've given a view on that. That's something to watch out for, possibly in terms of the discussion about which employees you might be furloughing. If in the worst case you are affected by that issue and the EMI share options for particular furloughed employees lose their tax advantages, then you might be looking at the concept of cancelling those options. Hopefully, of course, as people come back to work and come back to work full time, you may then re-grant them further options to replace those existing options, provided that the market value of their shares hasn't shifted substantially. So that's my run through some current tax issues on funding and share scheme issues under the COVID regime that we're working under. Please don't hesitate to contact me under either of those methods if you have any further questions, and I look forward to hearing from you. Goodbye.